Okay, so welcome once again I think this is the fourth study, fourth lesson. And I want to thank Pastor Christian for stepping in, and you'll probably be doing this in the near future as well for a few studies. So this is focused on prophecy. As we said previously, it is, we're focusing on two specific books in the scriptures. That will be Daniel and Revelation. Revelation is going to come a little bit later on. And for tonight, we're focusing on Daniel chapter 4. So far we dealt with Daniel chapter 1, the context, Daniel chapter 2, very captivating prophecy, one that's probably best known from the book of Daniel, that many people refer to, many Christians refer to, and not only Christians, from other religions as well. Daniel chapter 2 is an important chapter to many people. Then Daniel chapter 3, and as you can see in these first few chapters, the prophecy is important. Is in focus, and interpretation of dreams, and we're going to come to that. Why is it that God communicated in that fashion? Either tonight or in the next lesson, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But then there are a lot of life lessons in here. All right, very important life lessons. And after the Daniel's three friends experience, then we come to Daniel chapter 4. And as I said in my prayer, I think it is important for us to kind of like understand why we're studying this. I think it's fun. I like history. I love history. I love current events. I like to understand what's happening in the world. I like to know what's happened in the past. And in one of the New Testament letters to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul writes, referring to that which happened to the Israelites in the wilderness and their, journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. He says, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. So not necessarily that God wanted to make an example of them, but it is an example of human nature, how humans interact with divinity, and how divinity responded or interacted with humanity, and the response that they got from the interaction with God, and how God acted in those particular situations. So we're reading it not just as history, as mere history, but also for our instruction. There are lessons in it. We can learn things about ourselves, about life, and how we could apply them in our own lives. And it is relevant because it says here, to us, on whom the end of the ages has come. So it has relevance. There is an acknowledgement that, where we are at in history, and this is Paul speaking quite a while back, but it is meant for a generation, for a people, for us now studying the scriptures and applying these lessons to our own lives. So in chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3, what we learn or what we read is that Nebuchadnezzar makes a decree. This is chapter 3, verse 29. And by the way, I'm going to have long passages from the scriptures on the screen because I want us to read the Bible. And maybe sometimes it's a little bit difficult to refer, to your own Bible, maybe on the phone or the physical printed Bible. Maybe the translations are a bit different. So I'm gonna put it on the screen and go through the chapter together. So now to pick it up from where Christian left off, it's in chapter 3, verse 29. And Nebuchadnezzar is amazed at what and because he has the power. We need to remember this. Nebuchadnezzar was a man of means and a man of power. He gives a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. So he was absolutely amazed. He was impressed in his understanding. This God was obviously so much stronger and more powerful than the gods they worshipped. But then the way he goes about it, you see, it's still not that much about the God that he was amazed by. It's about him. It's about what he's going to do about this. And then he goes from one extreme to the other. And he still goes according to the principle of, I have the power, I will dictate you who to worship. And even though this was the true God, the way he went about it, imposing it, forcing people to worship God, tells me that he still did not get the lesson. So God was in the fire with the three young men. He was there to rescue them from persecution, to rescue them at a time of difficulty. But now Nebuchadnezzar mars his image, the image of a God who cares, the image of a God who loves, who intervenes in a time of trouble. And again, by association, introduces this God as autocratic, as a dictator. If you don't worship him, then in his name, I shall, tear you limb from limb, and I'm gonna, raid your houses, and I'm gonna lay them in ruins, and I'm gonna do this and that. So I think this is very important. Sometimes we may be very excited, we may understand that God is God, he's sovereign, but what kind of image of God do we present to the people? Chapter 4, verse 1. And this is interesting because, as we'll see a bit later on, but let me mention it now as well. This is the only portion in the Old Testament that's written by a non-Hebrew. And this is King Nebuchadnezzar himself speaking to us. It says, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Now, he has a message. After everything that's happened in chapter 3, he has time to think about it. And then he speaks on this. Because you see, what happened is that the story from, what happened in chapter 3 wasn't it. And verse 4, and we're going, chapter 4, from verse 4 to verse 12, we read. And as I go through the reading of the scriptures, I'm going to stop from time to time, because again, remember, what we read, what we study is meant to be for our own benefit. We need to understand, we need to get a blessing out of it. We need to learn lessons from it. So he begins, I, Nebuchadnezzar. So from this part on, it's him speaking. Was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I think this is very important. So he was in a good place. He wasn't going through anything difficult, He had one of those situations where he was just relaxed. And sometimes, when we find ourselves in difficult situations, we seek out to God. We try to, somehow make sense of the things that are happening. But in this particular case, he was at ease in his house, prospering in his palace. But then his peace was disturbed. Verse 5, I saw a dream that made me afraid. I'm sure we've all had situations like this. I don't know. I understand some people can't remember what they dream at night. I can remember quite vividly some of the dreams, especially, and I know it's not only unique to me, the ones I dream just before I wake up. Some of them are so vivid, and sometimes you're disturbed. Now, this dream made him afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. Now, this can be taken in different ways. Now, fancies and the visions, sometimes you daydream. Sometimes you just lie on bed, and sometimes you think about it. Your mind is preoccupied. You just reflect on things. But it seems here that this was a dream. Again, God communicated with Nebuchadnezzar through a dream. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Verse 7, then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in. Again, he's been through this before. He's appealed to these people before, and they let him down. So another lesson we can take out of this. Now, it's really interesting. Sometimes, even though when we find ourselves in a situation that we need an answer or we need advice, why is it? Because if you see the screen, you'll see that verse 8 starts at last. And I'll come to that. Why is it that we go to God as a last resort? Now, Nebuchadnezzar again goes to the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans. And this time, he knows the dream. He remembers the dream. So he tells them the dream. But they fail him again. They could not make known to me its interpretation. Now, this is a spiritual episode in his life. I don't think that, when we go through life's difficult situations or challenges, that we should not speak to our loved ones, that we should not consult with people that we trust. But I think that it should always, if I truly believe that God is in control, if I truly believe that God knows best, even before I go looking for comfort or for advice to anyone else, I should make God a priority. Because often we are let down, we are disappointed. People can disappoint us. That's the reality. And sometimes we are the ones disappointing other people. Now, Nebuchadnezzar makes this mistake. The outcome is the same. And then verse 8, at last, Daniel came in before me. And he finds it important to mention this. He who was named Belshazzar, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream, saying. So again, it's really, there are certain signs here that Nebuchadnezzar was in two minds. He found it very difficult to break away from that which was familiar to him. He first goes to the magicians and the Chaldeans, the astrologers, the people he used to go to for answers. Then he also finds it important to mention that Daniel's name was now Belshazzar, and that he was named after one of his gods, a god that was rendered impotent, a god that was rendered, weak and without, actually non-existent compared to the true God introduced to him by Daniel. But still, at last, he goes to Daniel. And he says, verse 9, O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians. You see how he finds it hard to break away. You're special. Then he says, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods, plural, is in you. You are special. There's something different about you. You have introduced me to this new God, but I still see you as the chief. Yeah, you are the top guy, but still the chief of the magicians. And I know that the spirit of the holy gods, plural, is in you. Interestingly enough, Daniel doesn't necessarily take that much time to correct him. Allows him to talk. He's there. So, to come back, O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirits of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you. Focus on Daniel. In his mind, he couldn't see it any other way. Tell me the visions of my dream that I saw in their interpretation. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. In it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from him. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. So the first part of the dream is quite interesting. He sees this huge tree, and this tree is all to all. And this tree was visible to the end of the whole earth. The influence reached to the end of the whole earth. There was prosperity. Everybody could be fed from it. Everybody could rest under its shade. All right? But then, in his vision, and this is interesting, behold, a watcher. Someone who observes. There are different interpretations here. A watcher in those days meant different things. But someone who was aware, someone who intervenes. And interestingly enough, now he calls this person, this being, a holy one, came down from heaven. So it's clear the origin. Remember the dream. Also, that big rock came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree, lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of man and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of man. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw, and you, O Belshazzar, tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. So it is a disturbing dream. But now if we think about it, I'm sure that, some of you are familiar with this passage, you are familiar with the interpretation, probably you've read the passage, maybe not for the first time, a number of times. But I find it so interesting how we look at this dream, and it is in a certain way a copy of the dream in Daniel 2, not in detail, not about kingdoms that are about to come. But in Daniel chapter 3, obviously, Nebuchadnezzar misunderstands the first dream. And as it was presented to you, the whole statue is made of gold. No, this is it. I'm it. And I'm sure to Nebuchadnezzar, the dream is disturbing, because here you have something good, and someone comes and messes with it. All right, we're going to come to the interpretation, because we're going to let Daniel interpret the dream for King Nebuchadnezzar and for us as well. So Daniel interprets the dream from verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, again, interestingly enough, needs to be mentioned, his name was Belshazzar, a little bit still hanging on to, I'm in control, I changed your name, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. So, of course, in those days, you had to be careful what you said to the king. You know, I mean, the king had all the power. You could offend the king by just a wrong look in his opinion, and you'd be gone. Belshazzar answered and said, so again, this is Daniel. My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. Daniel knew that this dream was about Nebuchadnezzar. That once again, this is so amazing how God just patiently tries to get through this man, this king, make him understand how important it is to acknowledge who God is and save him from himself. But Daniel here he uses tact. You know, sometimes we may have some news to give to someone, and we know that the news is not going to be, you know, easy to hear. We have to be tactful. Even when it comes to sharing God and sharing the Bible, we need to be tactful. As we can see, as far as Nebuchadnezzar is concerned, it was very hard for him to let go of that which he knew. That's all he knew. And I believe God persevered with Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar was honest. And he was someone who really believed that he was doing the right thing by following the gods that he knew from his childhood. So Daniel is tactful. But he doesn't dilly dally. He is also straight. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong so that its top reached the heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, in which was food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of the heavens lived. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Now, we're not going to, again, revisit how mighty Babylon was in that time. All right. And when it speaks about the fact that it was visible to the end of the whole earth, I think that an interpretation of that portion of the verse is that right now it is visible. We're talking about it. It reached us, not the whole earth as in the planet, but throughout history. We're still talking about it. We're reading about it. We're talking about Nebuchadnezzar. So this tree, this mighty tree, represents you, the same as the golden head represented you. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven to such an extent that God took an interest in Nebuchadnezzar and his destiny, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And because the king saw watch a holy one coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Listen, how beautiful this is. This is not just poetry. This is tenderness. This is care. I need to do something. I need to do something painful to you. And in this particular case, I think that, let me just stop here for a sec. I think that's probably one of the most difficult things for some people to accept, is that God is a God of love. How could a God of love tolerate, allow, or cause horrible things that are happening in people's lives and worldwide today? How could a loving God allow millions of kids to die of hunger? Why did God allow for a marriage to break down? How did he allow for someone who was ill to die? Where is God in those days, in those times? So for some people, it's really difficult. And I'm just going to interject here very quickly. My understanding of the scriptures is that there is one particular situation or circumstance where God truly intervenes and causes destruction and death and problems. And that is when he judges. But maybe we'll talk about that another time. So in this particular case, God steps in. This is not happening to Nebuchadnezzar just because God allowed it, or because, whatever other circumstances. God steps in. But God steps in for a reason. In this case, for an outcome he counted on as far as this king was concerned. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 periods of time pass over him. And now from verse 24, Daniel interprets the dream. O king, it is a decree. Remember how fond Nebuchadnezzar was to just hand out decrees. All right, go and you need to worship this image. And when God comes through for the 3 young men, now decree again, you need to worship this God, because if you don't. So he was very fond of decrees and commandments, and because he came from a position of authority. But now the Most High, Daniel says, he has a decree. And this decree has come upon my Lord the King, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. What an interpretation. And there's no, now we understand why Nebuchadnezzar was troubled. The Holy Spirit, spoke to him. The Holy Spirit gave him this dream and left him uneasy. We read right at the beginning that he was at ease in his palace. Well, now that dream left him uneasy. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, that's 7 years, till you know. And by the way, number 7 is very important in Hebrew understanding. This means, it's a number of perfection. So this process of Nebuchadnezzar's understanding and acknowledgement of who God is had to be completed and complete. 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of man and gives it to whom he will. Nebuchadnezzar was a man of power, of authority. And for whatever reason, God just steps in and says, okay, I need to teach him this lesson. I am in control. In our lives, we may be at ease right now. Maybe things are going well. Maybe we feel God, is really answering prayers. Things are going very well. And at times, even as Christians, we can become very self-assured that we are where we are because we worked hard, because we're intelligent, because we are faithful. So from a Christian perspective, now I'm not speaking as a king. I'm not a king. You are not a king or a queen. We are normal, common human beings, all right? But we are in the same danger as Nebuchadnezzar, as we will see a bit later on. And now God steps in and says, I want you to be reminded, even when things are going well, you are blessed. Please don't get me wrong. I believe God created us with the ability to think. We need to be innovative, creative. We need to persevere. We need to work hard. We need to apply our intelligence, and of course, God will open doors, but that's God's blessing, his leading. If we believe that God has everything under control and there's a purpose for this life, and there's an ultimate reason for our life, and that is that which is beyond the reality that we see right now, then it means that God is the one who provides. God is the one who blesses. And I know I'm preempting right now, but this lesson is about humility. Lucifer fell from heaven, beautiful creation of God, because he became proud. And humility is not necessarily a currency that many people want to trade in these days. Because then sometimes people take advantage of your goodness. Sometimes people misunderstand your humility and manipulate you. So people want to be strong, in control. Maybe sometimes we misunderstand what humility means. Because humility, true humility, needs to be reported or in relation to God. So coming back, verse 26, and as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you, confirmed, preserved for you, from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. So now Daniel sees the opportunity. And this is also extremely important. Prophecies, most prophecies in the scriptures are conditional. I do not believe that the Bible speaks about predestination. God predestines it in a certain way. I have no choice in the matter. But God can see all the scenarios that can happen. Yes, he transcends our reality and he knows what's going to happen. But at the same time, he is imminent. He is right here with us right now. That's a mystery. I cannot explain it exactly how God can be both at the same time. In the person of Jesus, it was clear because Jesus was right there in human form amongst human beings, while still being God and still 100% human. That's another mystery. So now Daniel understands this is a warning. It is a prophecy. It will happen if. But please, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. So Daniel says, what you saw, it's going to happen unless, and may perhaps, there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. The lengthening part I find very important because it implies it's not forever. Doesn't matter how long we live on this earth, how prosperous we are, we'll never have it all, and we'll never live forever under the circumstances that we're in right now as sinful human beings. Later on, we're going to read here, at the end of 12 months. You know, it may seem like a short period of time, but, you know, let me give Nebuchadnezzar some credit. Hey, he was able to somehow, you know, stay with the program for a while. But the time came when, overlooking his capital, the king looks around and he sees, I mean, friends, you know, we look at how advanced technologies today, but when it comes to imposing majesty, I don't think we can ever, as civilization, as a civilization, as human beings, be able to replicate what was in those days. And as he looks at Babylon, he says, it's not this great Babylon that I have built. It was indeed a magnificent metropolis. We read in the lesson, but Nebuchadnezzar's father, he defeated the Assyrians. He assisted in the rebuilding of Babylon. And yes, the city boasted many beautiful places, palaces, temples, shrines, and rooftop gardens. And I think that Most of us have heard of the Hanging Gardens, which were eventually considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. So if we think of Nebuchadnezzar, what he saw with his eyes, it was majestic. Sometimes let's come to us. Sometimes maybe we go out in the garden and we work in the garden, and you step back and you're just so happy with what you've done, or be it art, be it work. Sometimes we even look at our kids and we feel proud, of their achievements, and we want to take the credit. And I don't think that God had a problem with Nebuchadnezzar being proud of what he had achieved, but there was so much more in his heart. He took credit for it all, and he saw himself as above the Most High, the one who actually dictates the destinies of those under him, and that he has achieved, like Lucifer had this illusion and delusion that he will surpass who God is. He will take the place of the Most High. So at the end of the 12 months, what was prophesied took place. Nebuchadnezzar lost touch with reality, and pride led him to become deranged. He lost his mind. And he acted like a cow. And again, the lesson speaks about what psychiatry would call this today, boanthropy, whatever. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but it's thinking that you are an animal, and then you act like an animal, cow in this particular case. And he remained in that state for 7 years. And there's a description: uncut and uncombed hair looked like eagle feathers, fingernails grew and curled like claws. Quite an appearance. So from walking on the roof of his palace and looking down and saying, wow, this is me, I've done this, I'm all that, while God tried to, and why, just think about, why did God want to make Nebuchadnezzar aware of this? Well, Babylon had so much influence. And from the fall of humanity, God's image has been marred, God has been misrepresented. And this was an opportunity maybe for the riches of his kingdom to introduce to the rest of the world the God of the Jews, the true God that Daniel and his friends introduced to him. And it seems that Nebuchadnezzar was sensitive to that. I don't think God would have taken the time to speak to a man who would not have been prepared or capable to introduce God to the world. But God did not abandon him. At the end, verse 34, at the end of the days, you know what that means? The prophecy had a time limit, 7 years. I, Nebuchadnezzar, and now in his madness, in his disturbed state of mind, how did he get healed? Of course, we know God intervened. But I found this expression very important. I lifted my eyes to heaven. So even in that state, somehow God managed to speak to his mind and his heart. And this was the act which brought back his reason, his ability to think as a human being. Lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High. So that was the first action, the first thing he did. I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. You see how his language changes? in what he says. Friends, we live in a world with the idea of a creator God is almost seen as retrograde. It's obsolete. It's just old-fashioned. Religion doesn't necessarily, we shouldn't think that much about it. I think regardless of what human beings think of God, God is still the same. Nothing can take away, and nobody can take away from who and what God is. That's inconsequential to him. The way we think about God has no effect on God. It does have an effect on us and our society and the way we live today. Is there still a moral compass? Do we still know what right and wrong is? Which way do we go? So as Nebuchadnezzar lifts his eyes to heaven, the first thing he does, he acknowledges that the Most High God is worthy of praise and honor, and he's the one who lives forever. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. And listen, I've underlined, I put this in bold and try not to make it too red, because then it could come across as aggressive, but it's important. All his works are right, and his ways are just. Nebuchadnezzar, even the part where you had to wander, in the wilderness with the beasts of the field, not knowing who you are and just being a cow in a man's body. And that was God's judgment. That was his work. All his works, he says, are right, and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he's able to humble. Lesson learned. Now, as far as we are concerned, thinking of your own life, thinking of my life, I know there were situations in my life where I didn't really feel that his works were right and just. And then you need to reflect, you need to humble yourself before God and acknowledge that God is the Most High. Nothing happens without him knowing it. Nothing happens without him causing it or allowing it. This is a very sensitive part. That's God caused all the hurricanes and all the natural disasters that kill millions of innocent people. It's a tough one. But then when we make it personal in my life, all I need to say is God knows what he is doing, as long as I entrust myself into his care and his judgment. Those who walk in pride, he's able to humble. Maybe tonight, before we go to sleep, we need to reflect a bit on our own lives, our own characters. And I'm sure there's pride in all our lives. What do we do with it? Maybe there are things we don't see clearly. Maybe there are situations we don't understand, and we get hurt unnecessarily just because we are so proud to allow God to show us the true picture. There are people who are brighter than us. There are people who are better at our job than us. There are people who are more capable. But you know what? They have their own walk with God or against God. I don't know. Shouldn't be my subject matter for my thinking. But what I am at in my relationship with God, am I being faithful and humble and content with that which I have and I am? This lesson tells us it's not the riches, it's not power, it's not authority. There is nothing that actually determines our salvation. It is in our relationship with God, our acknowledgement that he is God. and that we are supposed to be dependent on him. I like how someone actually, what they said about Daniel 4. Daniel 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's personal testimony of God's love and patient persistence, the heathen king. Well, if God was that patient with that king, I think he will be with you and me too. The lesson ends with a story, which I may just choose to narrate because it's written so well. So you can even kind of like just close your eyes and you know what? These days there's that say you can watch the movie, because there's a movie that's been made about this. And it is the story of Desmond Doss. Some of you are familiar with it. You may have seen this, the movie. You may have read the book, the books. There are a number of books that have been written about him. And the lesson ends with the idea that, prayer, Bible study, perseverance, honoring God, being faithful, will lead us to this kind of faith that is principled, the kind of faith that is perseverant, and the kind of faith that keeps us close to God. So during World War II, a young Christian named Desmond Doss trained to become a medic. Later on the islands of Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa, he bravely dodged bullets and grenades to rescue his wounded buddies. Desmond wanted to live a consistent Christian life, even in the midst of war. I find this interesting. We can complain about our own situations, but you know what? I think this is quite a grave situation. And even his most profane fellow soldiers came to respect him. At first, they'd sometimes throw boots at him when he knelt by his cot for prayer. But during fierce fighting on the islands of the Pacific, they began to regard his quiet courage with awe. On May 5th, 1945, Desmond's unit was ordered to launch a major assault on the Maida escarpment. This 50-foot cliff was the key to controlling Okinawa. But on that fateful day, the Japanese had decided to launch an attack from the same location. Desmond's platoon of 200 men, just remember this number, 200 men, charged up a hill. Within a few minutes, they'd sustained 100 casualties. So in a few minutes, half of the platoon was killed. Within a few minutes, the platoon withdrew under a barrage of bullets and mortars, all except Desmond Doss. He stayed behind with the wounded. For the next few hours, he scurried around the top of the cliff with a rope litter he'd rigged up and managed to lower his comrades one after the other to safety. All this time, machine gun fire splattered around him, but miraculously, Desmond wasn't cut down. On that day, 75 fellow soldiers would owe their lives to him. So, quite a story, don't you think? A young man who wanted to be faithful to, to his God and not go into a war and kill, but save lives. And when the bullets started flying, he chose to stay behind and rescue his injured fellow soldiers, the guys who probably ridiculed him for his beliefs. That's humility. That's a faith that's grounded in the belief that we're here to serve. And it is my prayer that as we go through these lessons, we will be able to also learn lessons for our own lives. Nebuchadnezzar learned his. What about us? Okay, we've come to the end of the lesson for tonight, so probably we can stop the recording and